A 3,000-year-old book never mentions the year 2026. No prophet who wrote it could have known that number. Yet someone typed a question into Grok, a chatbot never built to translate ancient scripture, and asked it directly what this exact text says about this exact year. The answer is still spreading online. What the Book of Enoch actually is. The Book of Enoch, often called First Enoch by scholars to separate it from two later, unrelated texts sharing the same name, is an ancient Jewish text built around the biblical figure Enoch. Genesis describes Enoch as the great-grandfather of Noah, a man who walked with God and was taken up before he died a normal death. Scholars date the writing of 1st Enoch to somewhere between roughly 300 BC and the start of the 1st century AD, and it was not written by one person in one sitting. It is a collection of 5 separate sections, written across different generations, known as the Book of Watchers, the Book of Parables, an astronomical book, a book of dream visions, and an epistle of Enoch. The oldest and most read section, the Book of Watchers, expands on a strange 4-verse passage in Genesis chapter 6. That passage briefly mentions heavenly beings taking human wives and producing offspring before the flood. The Book of Enoch turns those 4 verses into a full story. A group of angels called the Watchers rebel against heaven, come down to earth, marry human women, and father a race of giants whose violence helps justify the flood that follows. That short expansion sets up almost everything the rest of the book cares about, including judgment, punishment, and fire. The specific fire and destruction passages that modern AI videos claim to have revealed as some kind of countdown to a specific year sit right inside this same story, and they have been sitting there in English translation since long before any chatbot existed. The fire that was already in the text. Here's the actual passage people are pointing AI chatbots at. In chapter 10 of the Book of Watchers, God sends the archangel Michael to deal with Semjaza, the leader of the rebel Watchers. The text describes Michael binding the Watchers and their followers for 70 generations, then leading them to what the text calls the abyss of fire, where they are shut up in torment for eternity. A few verses later, the text states plainly that Semjaza himself will be burnt and destroyed along with the others. A separate section, chapter 16, describes what happens to the giant offspring of the Watchers after they die in the wars the text describes earlier. The verse states that once the spirits leave their bodies, their flesh will be destroyed before the day of judgment. Later chapters build an even bigger fire scene. In chapter 18, Enoch describes traveling to a place he calls chaotic and horrible, where he sees stars bound together and burning like mountains, and beyond that, a massive fire with columns descending into an abyss so deep he says he could not measure it. Chapter 1 describes mountains melting like wax and hills sinking low when God arrives to execute judgment on the wicked. None of these passages contain a calendar date, a countdown, or any reference to a specific year at all, ancient or modern. The text speaks in terms of generations, ages, and a final judgment whose timing is left deliberately unspecified. That detail matters enormously once you start looking at what people are actually claiming Grok found when they type the number 2026 into the same conversation. What Grok actually does with a passage like this. Grok is a chatbot built by XAI, Elon Musk's AI company. Like other large language models, it can read a passage of text a person pastes in or asks about, and it can summarize, rephrase, or comment on that passage in plain language. That is a genuinely useful skill. It is not the same thing as decoding a hidden message, performing a scholarly translation from an ancient language, or calculating a real prophetic date. The Book of Enoch that Grok or any other chatbot reads is not some sealed vault text nobody has seen. The version almost everyone quotes online is either the 1821 English translation by Richard Lawrence or the more detailed 1912 translation by R.H. Charles, both built from Ethiopic manuscripts that have been sitting in university libraries for over a century. When a video says I found something about the end of 2026 inside this text, in almost every case the AI is reading an English translation that already existed, Noticing that the person asking wants an answer connected to 2026 and generating a response that stitches the book's existing fire and judgment language together with whatever the asker mentioned, because that is exactly how a large language model is designed to respond to a leading question. A lot of these videos follow a near identical production pattern. Someone types a leading question into a chatbot, something like ask it whether the Book of Enoch describes events matching this exact year. The chatbot responds with dramatic language, because that is the tone the question invited, and the response gets read aloud over stock footage, with a thumbnail showing a shocked face. None of that process involves new research, new translation work, or new evidence. It involves a chatbot mirroring the emotional tone and the specific year mentioned in whatever question it was asked, which is a known behavior of these systems and not a sign that something important was uncovered. This does not mean chatbots are useless for a topic like this. They can genuinely help someone understand old, dense religious language faster than reading a full academic commentary. The problem is, specifically, the framing used in a lot of online content, where a chatbot restating a translation and echoing a year the user already typed gets presented as if the AI calculated or uncovered a genuine prophetic timeline. Why the year itself never appears in the text. Nowhere in any surviving Aramaic, Greek, or Ethiopic manuscript of the Book of Enoch does the text reference the Gregorian calendar, year 2026, or any calendar system that could reliably be converted into that specific year. The book's own astronomical book, one of its 5 sections, does describe a detailed calendar system built around a 364-day solar year, used to track the movement of the sun, moon, and stars across 12 named gates. That system was a genuine, ancient attempt to organize time for religious and agricultural purposes, and scholars studying it have compared it directly to similar calendar systems described in other Second Temple period Jewish texts, including material connected to the Dead Sea Scrolls community at Qumran. Nothing in that calendar system, however, points forward to any specific future year the way a modern prediction claims. The book's judgment scenes are described using generational and cosmic language, phrases like 70 generations, or until the day of the Great Judgment, deliberately vague terms that ancient apocalyptic writers used across many different texts, precisely because they were describing an event they believed lay somewhere in an unspecified future, not pinning it to an exact calendar date the way a modern almanac might. This same basic pattern, an old religious or symbolic text getting mapped onto a specific dramatic modern date that the original text never mentions, has repeated itself many times across recent history, and looking at how those earlier predictions actually turned out is useful before treating this one as anything different. If ancient texts and real research like this are your kind of thing, subscribing helps this channel keep making them. The long history of dates that didn't arrive. Predictions built around ancient or religious texts pointing to a specific imminent end date have a long, well-documented track record of simply not coming true. The idea that the ancient Maya-long count calendar predicted the world would end on December 21st, 2012 spread widely for years beforehand, despite Maya scholars repeatedly explaining that the date simply marked the end of one calendar cycle and the beginning of a new one, the same way December 31st marks the end of a year on a modern calendar without ending the world. When the date passed without incident, the same basic prediction style shifted onto other targets in the years that followed, including a series of specific dates tied to a supposed hidden planet called Nibiru, predicted at various points to arrive in 2003, then 2012, then September and November of 2017, then April 2018, each date passing quietly, while later predictions simply moved the goalposts forward again. That repeating pattern, a specific date announced with confidence, arriving without the predicted event, followed by a new date replacing the old one, is itself a piece of evidence worth weighing seriously. A genuine, verifiable prophecy tied to a real calendar date does not typically need to be pushed back and reissued every few years under a new label. The 2026 version of this same pattern follows the identical shape, an old text with no specific date mentioned inside it, paired with a chatbot response shaped entirely by the year the person asking happened to type into the question box. There is a real AI project involving the name Enoch. Before anyone built an AI actually named Enoch, the same University of Groningen research group had already spent years developing the technology behind it on a different, even more famous scroll. In 2021, researchers Mladen Popovic, Maruf Dali, and Lambert Shoemaker published a study in the journal PLOS One focused on the Great Isaiah Scroll, one of the longest and most studied manuscripts among the original Dead Sea Scrolls. Some scholars had long suspected the scroll's 54 columns of text might have been copied by more than one scribe, based on subtle shifts in spacing partway through the manuscript. But the theory had never been widely accepted because the handwriting looked nearly identical even to trained specialists. The team built a piece of software called Binet to test this, training it to measure microscopic differences in letter shape and ink stroke curvature that no human eye could reliably track across the full manuscript. The analysis found a clear, measurable shift in handwriting style, beginning around column 27, confirming two separate scribes had worked on the scroll. That project proved the underlying handwriting analysis technology worked on a real, high-stakes biblical manuscript, and it set the stage for the far larger project the same team launched a few years later. In 2025, the same research team, again led by Professor Mladen Popovic, director of the University of Groningen's Qumran Institute, published a new study introducing an AI model built to help date ancient Hebrew and Aramaic manuscripts, including the Dead Sea Scrolls. The team named the model Enoch, after the same biblical figure, specifically because ancient tradition connects Enoch with calculations involving calendars and time. This model works completely differently from a chatbot. It does not read or interpret meaning inside a text at all. Instead, it studies the physical handwriting on a manuscript, measuring things like the exact curve of an ink stroke and the precise shape of individual letters, features too small for a human expert to reliably measure by eye. Researchers first trained the system on manuscripts that had already been dated using radiocarbon testing, giving it a confirmed answer key to learn from. Then they tested the model on manuscripts with known ages that it had not seen before, and its independent guesses matched the confirmed ages a large majority of the time, with published accuracy figures landing somewhere between roughly 79 and 85% depending on how the results were reviewed. Once the model proved itself, researchers pointed it at 135 Dead Sea Scroll fragments that had never been radiocarbon dated at all. Most of the new estimates skewed older than earlier handwriting-based guesses, in some cases by 50 to 100 years. Two fragments in particular produced a striking result. One, catalogued as 4Q114, preserves verses from the Book of Daniel. The other, catalogued as 4Q109, preserves verses from Ecclesiastes. Combining fresh radiocarbon testing with the Enoch model's handwriting analysis pushed both estimates back far enough to place the manuscripts close to the lifetimes of the people traditionally credited with writing those books. That result is genuinely remarkable, and it happened without a single chatbot reading a single line of scripture or being asked about any specific future year. It is also a completely different kind of AI project than the videos describing the end of 2026, which raises an obvious question about whether anyone has actually pointed a real research-grade AI at the content of the Book of Enoch's judgment passages themselves. Has anyone actually used AI to study the fire passage itself? As of now, there is no published, peer-reviewed study where an AI model analyzed the meaning or wording of the Book of Enoch's fire and judgment passages the way the Enoch model analyzed handwriting on the Dead Sea Scrolls. Scholars already use a technique called stylometry, a statistical fingerprint of an author's word choices and sentence patterns, to help figure out where one ancient author's writing ends and another's begins inside a composite text like this one. That kind of tool could, in theory, be pointed directly at the fire and judgment sections to test whether they were written by the same hand as the calendar sections or the giant birth story elsewhere in the book. Large language models trained specifically on ancient Aramaic, Hebrew, and Ge'ez could also, in theory, help translators flag places where the Ethiopic version and the Aramaic Dead Sea Scroll fragments disagree with each other on wording. Small differences like that can matter a lot historically, since they can show how the text changed as it moved between languages and centuries. Nobody has published a study doing this specifically for the fire and judgment chapters yet, and certainly nobody has published anything connecting those chapters to the calendar year 2026. That gap between what people online claim happened and what has actually been published is exactly the kind of thing worth being honest about, because pretending otherwise is how real interest in an old text turns into noise nobody can trust. The next question is, why this book, with all its fire and judgment imagery, nearly disappeared from Western Christianity in the first place, since that real history is considerably more interesting than any invented countdown. The New Testament connection. The Epistle of Jude, a short letter included in the New Testament, quotes the Book of Enoch by name and by content. Verses 14 and 15 of Jude echo a prophecy attributed to Enoch, describing him as the seventh generation from Adam, and repeating a specific line about the Lord coming with 10,000s of his holy ones to carry out judgment. This is not a loose thematic echo. The wording is close enough that scholars treat it as a direct quotation, the same way another New Testament writer might quote directly from Isaiah or the Psalms. Early church writers noticed this connection right away. Tertullian, a Christian author writing around 200 AD, treated the Book of Enoch as a legitimate and useful text, partly because Jude had already quoted it as though it carried real authority. For a stretch of early Christian history, this book sat in an unusual spot, respected and referenced by name, yet never formally locked into the official canon most churches would eventually settle on. That unresolved status set up exactly the kind of slow fade that would eventually strip this book almost entirely out of Western hands, even while the fire and judgment imagery inside it kept echoing through later Christian ideas about final judgment. The book that vanished from the West. Despite its early influence, the Book of Enoch was left out of the canon, accepted by Rabbinic Judaism and by nearly every Christian tradition that developed in Europe, including Catholic, Orthodox, and later Protestant churches. In the centuries following the early Christian period, full copies of the text stopped circulating across most of the ancient and medieval world. By around 400 AD, European scholars only knew the book through scattered quotations preserved inside other unrelated writings, along with a partial Greek manuscript. There was exactly one place where this did not happen. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, along with the closely related Eritrean Orthodox Church, preserved the complete text continuously, translated into Ge'ez, the ancient liturgical language of Ethiopia, and treated it as fully canonical scripture, sitting right alongside the rest of the Bible. While the rest of Christianity slowly forgot the book existed in complete form, Ethiopian churches kept copying, reading, and using it in worship without any interruption at all. For roughly 13 centuries, that made Ethiopia the only place on earth where a complete copy of this book still existed, sitting almost entirely outside the awareness of European scholars who assumed it was lost for good. The explorer who brought it back. In 1773, a Scottish explorer named James Bruce traveled through Ethiopia while searching for the source of the Blue Nile. During his travels, he obtained several Ethiopic manuscripts of the Book of Enoch and brought them back to Europe, reintroducing the complete text to Western scholarship for the first time in over 1,000 years. It took decades for that reintroduction to reach ordinary readers. In 1821, Richard Lawrence, a scholar at Oxford, produced the first full English translation based on the Ethiopic manuscripts Bruce had recovered. Later, scholar R.H. Charles produced a more detailed, heavily annotated translation, first in 1893 and then in an expanded 1912 edition, which became the standard English version used by researchers for most of the century that followed. A separate discovery in Egypt, at a site called Akhmim in 1886 and 1887, turned up a partial Greek manuscript covering roughly the first third of the text, giving scholars an independent ancient source to compare against the Ethiopic version. None of this proved the book was actually ancient, rather than a later invention dressed up to look old. That proof would not arrive until the middle of the 20th century, and it came from a location nobody expected. proving it was not a later fake. Between 1947 and 1956, a collection of ancient manuscripts now known as the Dead Sea Scrolls was discovered in caves near Qumran, close to the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea. Among the roughly 900 texts pulled from these caves, researchers identified fragments of 11 separate Aramaic manuscripts containing portions of the Book of Enoch, dating from approximately 200 BC to 50 BC. Aramaic was the everyday spoken language of Judea at the time, the same language most scholars believe Jesus spoke, and finding the book written in this language this early settled a debate that had lingered for over a century. Before this discovery, critics could reasonably argue that the version preserved in Ethiopia might be a later fabrication, assembled long after the fact and falsely presented as ancient. The Qumran fragments made that argument essentially impossible to sustain. 11 separate copies is a genuinely striking number. For comparison, the same caves produced only 4 surviving manuscript copies of the Song of Solomon, 4 of Ruth, 3 of Ecclesiastes, and 0 of the Book of Esther, despite Esther appearing in every Protestant, Catholic, and Orthodox Bible printed today. Researcher Joseph T. Millick led much of the early work identifying and publishing these Aramaic fragments. The same caves also produced 9 separate Aramaic manuscripts of a related text called the Book of Giants, which expands further on the same angelic rebellion story, but was never folded into the Book of Enoch itself. Between these 2 sets of fragments, it became clear that this fire and judgment tradition was far more widely read in ancient Judea than any single surviving book fully captures. One entire section of the Book of Enoch was strangely missing from every fragment pulled out of those caves, and that gap turned into its own small mystery. The missing section. Every part of the Book of Enoch showed up somewhere among the Qumran fragments except one. The Book of Parables, sometimes called the Similitudes, spans chapters 37 through 71 and contains some of the text's most theologically significant material, including repeated references to a heavenly figure called the Son of Man, language that later became important to how early Christians described Jesus. Scholars generally read this absence as meaningful rather than accidental. If the Qumran community was copying every other section of the book repeatedly, and even went out of its way to preserve the separate Book of Giants, it seems unlikely that a widely read Book of Parables would have simply escaped their attention by pure chance. The more common explanation is that this section developed later, or within a different religious circle, than the one responsible for the Qumran collection. That layered, multi-author history is not unusual for ancient religious texts, but it adds one more piece of complexity to a book that has already spent more than 2,000 years disappearing and reappearing across different continents and languages, long before anyone thought to ask a chatbot what it meant for one specific modern year. Why it never made the cut. Despite its clear popularity at Qumran, its direct quotation in the letter of Jude, and its respected status among early writers like Tertullian, the Book of Enoch was ultimately left out of the canon adopted by Rabbinic Judaism and by the vast majority of Christian traditions that took shape in the following centuries. Exactly why any individual text made it into a final canon while another did not is rarely a simple story, and Enoch's case involves theological concerns, questions about who actually wrote it, and the simple fact that once a text stops being copied and circulated in a region, it naturally drifts out of consideration for formal inclusion. Part of the hesitation among later church authorities also came from the fact that the text blurred a line. Most Orthodox theology tried to keep firm, describing evil as something that began among heavenly beings themselves, rather than starting purely as a human failing in the Garden of Eden. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church remains the clear exception to that pattern, continuing to treat the book as canonical scripture to this day, fully integrated into its liturgy and theology, rather than treated as a curiosity. That single unbroken thread of continuous use is largely why a complete version of the text survived at all, and it is the exact reason James Bruce had somewhere to find it in 1773, when the rest of the Christian world had already lost track of it completely. What real analysis would actually need to overcome. Any serious attempt to apply AI directly to the Book of Enoch's language runs into real, well-known obstacles almost immediately. The surviving Aramaic fragments from Qumran are exactly that. Fragments, small torn pieces of parchment covering only a fraction of the full text, meaning any AI trained on them would be working from a genuinely incomplete dataset compared to the far more complete Ethiopic version. The Ethiopic version itself exists in roughly 80 known manuscripts that do not all agree with each other perfectly, so even defining a single stable version of the text to study is its own significant challenge scholars have debated for decades. Translation adds another layer of difficulty entirely. Moving a text from Aramaic to Greek to Ge'ez, and then into modern English, gives enormous room for individual translators to make different, defensible choices about ambiguous words and phrases, choices that any AI model would inherit directly from whichever human translated the training data it learned from. This is the same problem that has undermined several past claims about AI successfully decoding other ancient scripts, where the AI's output turned out to be only as reliable as the material it was trained on, and no better. There is also a well-known tendency for large language models to produce confident-sounding answers even when they do not have enough information to actually support them, a behavior researchers call hallucination. Applied to a text like this, that tendency is especially risky, because a chatbot might describe a passage with total confidence while quietly filling gaps with details that are not actually in the source material, including tying a passage to a specific year simply because that year appeared somewhere in the conversation. A human scholar checking a claim against the Aramaic fragments or the Ge'ez manuscripts can catch that kind of error. A viewer watching a video with no access to the original text has no way to catch it at all. A chatbot like Grok, reading a passage about fire and judgment, is working entirely from that same secondhand English translation, with no way to check its answer against the original Aramaic or Ge'ez, and no built-in ability to independently calculate a real prophetic date the ancient authors never wrote down. Any credible AI project touching this book would need what the real Enoch dating model already insisted on: careful human expert review at every step, transparent publication of methods so other scholars can check the work, and real caution about announcing results before they have actually been verified. That is a far less exciting process than a viral video promising a countdown to the end of a specific year, but it is the only version of this story that would actually hold up to scrutiny. What we actually know now. The Book of Enoch is a real, well-documented ancient text, composed in layers across several centuries, quoted directly in the New Testament letter of Jude, preserved completely for over 1,000 years, only by the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, and confirmed as genuinely ancient once 11 Aramaic fragments turned up among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran. Its fire and judgment passages, including the Watchers being cast into an abyss of fire and the giants' bodies being destroyed before the final judgment, have been sitting in public English translations since 1821 and 1912, describing a judgment timed only in vague generational terms, with no calendar date attached to it at all. A chatbot reading those passages out loud and connecting them to whatever year a person types into the question box is not the same thing as a scientific discovery, even when a video calls it terrifying or shocking. The real AI breakthrough tied to this book's name came from a completely different direction: a University of Groningen research team that built a model called Enoch to study handwriting on the Dead Sea Scrolls themselves, successfully pushing back the estimated dates of 2 biblical fragments close enough to place them within the lifetimes of their traditional authors. That same pattern of specific, unfounded end date predictions tied to old texts has already played out repeatedly in recent memory, from 2012 to multiple failed Nibiru dates between 2003 and 2018, each one arriving and passing without incident before the predictions simply moved on to the next date. Given how much this book has already survived, disappearing from an entire continent for over 1,000 years, only to resurface, get confirmed by scroll fragments buried in a desert cave, and now get pulled into the middle of an AI hype cycle, tying it to a single calendar year, it never mentions, it would not be the strangest chapter in its history. If you want more deep dives that separate what is actually real from what is just a good headline, subscribing costs nothing and keeps this channel chasing down stories exactly like it.